to another Note to File Live podcast. I'm going to go ahead and throw up our guest now, my good pal, Jamie Massengill. Jamie, how's it going, man?
Doing great, thanks. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to sit with you and have this discussion.
Took far too long to get you on. I think it's perfect conversation, perfect timing for a conversation like this too. It's a big topic, in the community. We've sort of seen the way things are going. It's really not working, right? I mean, there's a lot of problems the way that the clinical trials are being performed. So I think we've been able to accomplish something fairly unique and fairly successful in a pretty short amount of time. And I know it's something I get a lot of calls about. People are always looking for, tips, advice, and sort of lessons learned. So awesome conversation. Looking forward to it. If you guys feel free to throw in comments and questions as we go along, we're always happy to answer those. And I'm going to start out like every show. Just tell us a bit about your background, kind of what brought you into the clinical trial space, and tell us your clinical trial origin story, if you will.
Sure. Well, I would say my research interest started as an undergraduate. I got an undergraduate degree in psychology, and post-graduation, I worked with a group of psychiatrists and neuropsychologists heavily involved in clinical trial work. And so I went sort of from paper, pencil, basic research into the clinical trial world fairly quickly after that undergraduate degree. And then I continued that research interest on into a graduate degree in biological psychology and more human research. It wasn't necessarily bench research, although the department had the opportunity for both bench and human research. I was more on the neuroscience end of things with human research, and then continued on and went through training as a physician assistant, and I've practiced medicine for the last 20 years. And that involved stays in several different subspecialty or general practice areas. I've worked in inpatient and outpatient psychiatry, palliative care, interventional and medical pain management, urgent care, primary care, as well as in sleep medicine. And during those clinical opportunities over the last 20 years, a number of those practices either allowed for involvement in clinical trial work or specifically in the sleep medicine arena. I helped that organization start from ground up, maybe not as large of a footprint as what we've been able to create over the last 3 years at SSM, but at least the beginnings of a clinical trial institute for device and investigational product drug research. And so it was really that combination between clinical practice and that itch to continue to be involved in research that kept me in close contact with industry-sponsored research, even academic, quasi-academic partnerships with local entities and so forth that may not have been in the industry-sponsored world. And then about 3 years ago, had the opportunity to step in this role at SSM in the Oklahoma region to help basically build a research infrastructure from the ground up. And that kind of really brings us to our crossing of paths, daily interaction, and where we're at today.
Yeah. So I guess talk about your role today as it stands. I think it's, at least in my experience, fairly unique in terms of what we're seeing across other institutions. You know this too. You've seen and are talking to other institutions, other setups that are similar to ours. Maybe what we do is not necessarily, 100% novel. I do think it's probably got some variations on it that maybe have contributed to its success, likely. So I guess talk a little bit about what your role looks like on a day-to-day.
Sure. Well, I really have access to and a purview and a lens internal to a community-based hospital system. So SSM is a Catholic non-for-profit community-based hospital organization that's based out of St. Louis. We do have a connection to St. Louis University, so there is some of an academic medicine model involved, at least in the home office territory of St. Louis. But we have regions across Wisconsin, Southern Illinois, mid Missouri, and then in Oklahoma. And so I really have purview both into our regional organizational structure and then somewhat into the other regions and the system wide from a research related perspective. And really one of the striking things is that there is a regional flavor to each of the areas of the organization. And I think we see this across other large community-based hospital systems, or even practices that have multiple locations, that what's often found is a cookie cutter approach or a top-down approach when it comes to multiple service lines, but specifically research, isn't necessarily the most progressive way by which we can accomplish what we want to on a day-to-day basis. So my purview within the organization allowed for the ability to really start from the ground up and establish some necessary pieces of the puzzle per se that weren't present. And that was an advantage, I think, at times, and a disadvantage, because we had a pretty well a clean slate starting off, to where that meant initially drafting appropriate policies and procedures, putting together a regional research oversight body for acknowledgement and oversight of projects, since there's not a local IRB in the SSM system for at least the Oklahoma region. There are in other regions, and then putting together all of the other pieces of the puzzle that we may talk about later that became very important at addressing physician needs and appropriate compensation methods based on corporate responsibility input and legal input and fair market valuations, and then applying certain organizational principles such as the ethical and religious directives of the Catholic healthcare institution that might be different than other community-based institutions. So working from the inside, that allowed me to really have access to each of those pieces of the puzzle, all the while then trying to figure out the much more complicated, which becomes, we can work through each of the regulatory and oversight and compensation and other ethics and mission integration, corporate responsibility, legal, all of those aspects of an organization. But then now, once you put those in place, it becomes, how in the world do we do the rest of this thing called research? And that was really the springboard into that relationship with Hightower, or with an independent community-based research organization, to help provide that infrastructure that wasn't present otherwise.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's a great explanation. And I guess kind of leads me to a question. Why wouldn't an institution take on the burden, so to speak, itself? Why? I mean, what are some reasons? Again, I know this stuff. I talk about it all the time, but I think it's nice to hear, the other side. It sounds easy. Maybe it sounds like there's more benefit to owning, the research program versus working with a partner. I guess, what are some reasons that, an institution would prefer a partnership versus trying to sort of reinvent the wheel, so to speak?
Sure. I've used this sort of analogy multiple times, and we'll expand it a little bit here. But I really think research in general, whether it be industry-sponsored work or other academic or quasi-academic research work, we're really operating almost as if we're a restaurant per se. So back in the kitchen, you've got the PIs and the sub-Is that are our chefs and our sous chefs. And, that's where the magic is happening. And our ingredients really are all of those pieces of the puzzle that may be anything from subject recruitment to the other coordinating of ancillary services that go along with budgetary needs and requirements of protocols. But also within that, you've got this multifaceted, multi-directional menu that's out in front of our audience. And that audience might be those that are our sponsors or CROs that are vetting the organization for potential involvement in a particular research project. Those also might be critics, and those critics may be our site monitors, or those that are within the CROs, or those that are within the organization that are holding us accountable, whether it be legal or corporate responsibility or mission integration and otherwise. And then all the while we have the intermixings of the rest of the staff that's involved. So we have those that are involved in recruitment and the host and the hostess type staff, and those that are taking care of those critics and those folks that are coming through the door, looking at that menu that we have, meaning what's behind the scenes that we can offer them, what types of concoctions can we come up with to tempt, you know, the next sponsor to want to bring a project to us. How do we look different than an academic institution, and what can we offer in rapidity and startup and reduced red tape and other types of things that happen at the organic levels of an academic institution? How might we be able to navigate some of the authority vacuum that comes with not having a local IRB versus duplication of IRB related human oversight capabilities from a centralized IRB, and then again at an academic, and how we're not necessarily having to navigate that, but we've got that trial committee that's behind the scenes as our general managers and so forth of that restaurant. And so we have all of these inner workings, and then you have to say, well, in addition to that, we have to have a building of which our trials are run in, our restaurant is run in, and do we own it or do we lease it, or how does that work? Then we have to look at all of the equipment, and do we own it? Do we lease it? Do we lease to own it? Is it being provided to us by, you know, some sort of vendor so that we can, you know, have our PIs or our chefs be putting everything together so we can put out a quality product for it to go back out front to those CROs and those vendors and those critics, and to keep the organization happy because they're out in that waiting room or they're out in that dining room as well. And you start adding all of that together, and you quickly start figuring out that, do we really want to own all of this? You could own all of it. And I think academic institutions have shown us over time that yes, you can own it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to operate at an optimal level. Even the academic institutions that have the best of the best name from a research perspective, that are you know, Class Act research institutions, still struggle with those red tape items and those slowdowns and difficulty with budget negotiations and contract negotiations and those types of delays. So then you say, well, a community-based system has a lot of positives that may be negatives to some of the other more traditional industry-sponsored per se research offerings. And so then that begs your question of, well, why not own all of it? Well, owning all of it then has us take a step into, are you willing to take the risk of a pandemic that comes through and closes procedural space down or reduces clinic access, so now we're unable to recruit subjects into studies, and so revenue reduces substantially, such that now when you have these FTEs, these very experienced individuals, from boots on the ground research associates to budgets and contracting specialists to regulatory specialists, and all of those other pieces of the puzzle that are responsible for keeping that restaurant running and functioning. How do you support that within a community-based organization when you have a particular slowdown such as that? Or what if it is that you run into an issue of being able to supply appropriate revenue generating studies in the particular departments, as we see, you know, trial opportunities wax and wane through different subspecialty areas. It may be that endocrinology is a very hot area now, but 10 years from now, it may be that that's not where all of the eggs need to be placed in a basket, or whether it be vaccine studies or whether it be advanced cancer diagnostic studies. So you're constantly then having to look at a diversified portfolio of how do we then support this if we own each and every one of those aspects. And then you bring in another set of regulatory and oversight principles within an organization to where you start that red tape process of quicksand when it becomes from a legal and a regulatory and a corporate responsibility environment, so that you have so many, I guess, cooks in the kitchen now that you can't help but not get anything accomplished. And I think we see this over and over in certain research institutions, whether they be academic or non-academic, community-based situations. And so it really made sense for me as a regional director to say, what is the most appropriate way by which we can start quickly, be efficient, have all of the appropriate regulatory, budgets and contracting, specialized individuals that I can't afford in a startup department, but have each of those pieces of the puzzle. And it made most sense to then, instead of buy it, partner with it. And that's where that decision was made, to partner, such that once we open that restaurant, we have all of those pieces of the necessary puzzle together, but we can do that in a partnership model such that there is limited financial risk to the organization. There is maximum gain to be had from both the partner and the organization, as we're both bringing significant value to that partnership, in that we can't enroll in the studies without access to the trial population. And that's where the organization comes from. We can't attract studies without seasoned investigators. That's where those physicians that are in the hospital or the medical group come to the table. And so the organization is inputting necessary pieces to make that restaurant operate. And then on the other side, the community partner is providing a lot of those vital pieces of the infrastructure that weren't present ahead of time. To go and hire those individuals would have taken years-long process, and then you're significantly behind the ball at from a revenue generation standpoint, with an organization looking and saying, how are you going to get back into the green after all of this? So it just made much more sense for that partnership, and allowed for both organizations, meaning Hightower and SSM, to operate in parallel, such that when we hit the ground running, we've basically been in the green since day one. And I think that's one of the most important things to really look at, is that although financial is not the ultimate motivation in this, I think there are a number of other driving motivations and why we would bring research into a community-based practice, or a multi-specialty practice with multiple locations, or a community-based hospital system. And I think we can touch on those, but that's sort of the focus. In, when we at SSM initially started to look at sort of opening that research restaurant, when you lay all of those pieces out as to what can we afford, what can we do, what do we do well, and what does somebody else do better, and let's go find that better partnership instead of limping along to just try to make it work. Instead, let's really make it be functional.
Yeah, I mean, and we know, especially if you're on this and listening, you likely know. I mean, look, it's complicated and it's costly. I mean, very, very simply put, it requires a lot of, as you covered, I mean, a lot of moving parts, right? There's a lot of herding of cats that kind of goes into the clinical trial process. And I really do believe that it's best executed with sort of, you've got your specialists on each side. I think that's worked perfectly. And, even to your point about academic medical centers, I mean, let's be honest, I think something we all sort of inherently know now is that most of them, I mean, they aren't any better, more efficient than private research sites. And in fact, oftentimes they're much, much less successful than private research sites are. And I think if you talk to people in these academic medical centers, they'll also, maybe apprehensively let you know too, that, I mean, a lot of times they're not making money. They're losing quite a bit of money with these research departments. And, if you're a health system, you want research, right? I mean, all the benefits that aren't just financial, and let's also not kid ourselves. There are clear financial benefits, but you want these centers of excellence. You want to be able to attract physicians who want to do research and have the ability to do it. Taking that on from scratch can be ridiculously overwhelming. I think, again, we started out actually, contracted slightly before you came on.
Right.
And, this is where I think, again, you kind of look at the way that the different models are put together. We were in the GI group. It was okay. We had a couple of studies, but we weren't really going anywhere within the system. It's almost impossible. And again, if you're an IRO or if you're a site SMO, you've only got a certain amount of leverage, I guess, so to speak, and insight into the practices with which you work. So we were here on campus, but we couldn't really get beyond, a couple of studies in the GI area, which obviously was leaving a great deal on the table. And again, let's be honest, if I go talk to a doctor, they don't care about me. I'm some guy in a third party from some vendor, essentially, in their mind. So I guess, first of all, how much has the embracing of this, by SSM led to its success? And I guess, what else have you, you've seen, you're out here, what's going on in other areas and in other companies, other parts of the industry. I mean, do you think that people are missing out on trying to do too much rather than really split these partnerships the way that, we've been able to do here in Oklahoma?
Sure. I would say there's an obvious and distinct advantage to the partnership model. It diversifies risk for both sides. It allows a lot of parallel companionship in both sides working together for the same end, and we're both motivated to increase that research footprint. And as you mentioned just a few moments ago, the buy-in from the organization, the buy-in from the regional leadership has been very strong from the very beginning. And I think a lot of that has to do with really the foundation that we set forth. And it really has 4 or 5 main pieces to it, well before we get to the financial incentive of research. And that is really, why do we set out to do research, or at least me as a clinician, why would I be involved in that? And that's really so that I can offer patients potential life-saving or life-altering or other types of devices or investigational medications or so forth, the opportunity to be involved with treatments that either otherwise they wouldn't have access to because either they had exhausted commercially available products or devices, or they were uninsured or underinsured, and the clinical trial arena allows them, at least for an interim period, to have access to care that they may not have otherwise been able to do so. So that adds to the relevance of a community-based system. I don't necessarily like to use the word competition, but in the healthcare arena, it's really like no other service arena. That they're still competing for covered lives. They're competing for individual lives within the organization, and you have to stay and maintain a relevance. And to do so, each organization within any metropolitan area, they may have excellent cardiologists or they may have excellent gastroenterologists, but it may set you apart in that you've got the offering of research. So that community relevance of not only offering patients things that were not available otherwise, you now increase the relevance of your community-based system to attract new covered lives into your organization. The next thing that research really allows in a community-based system that's not otherwise available to a lot of these physicians is that physicians are inherently curious. And they enjoy looking at dissecting data and information, and a number of them enjoy the involvement in research, but they don't necessarily have the background, the infrastructure, other things that might be necessary to get a research footprint established in a community organization. They don't necessarily want to work in an academic institution. That's not their calling. They feel led more in the clinical environment, but they still have this scratch that needs to be itched, and that's research. And now offering that in a community-based system allows us to attract advanced practitioners nurses, other ancillary and support related individuals that may not have considered a community-based system before, because we now have that research offering. Other benefits of that research within the organization, which are notable and that these are traceable and trackable and quantifiable, is that you can improve network integrity and reduce the leakage of patients that may have to be referred into other organizations to become involved in clinical trial opportunities. This sometimes is a forced necessity. So let's say that you have a comprehensive center designation in your oncology department, or your heart and vascular department, or your stroke care department. Research is a quantifiable, necessary piece of that comprehensive center designation. And if you, as a community-based organization, want to have that relevance and you want to have that insight into that comprehensive world, and you want to be able to advertise that appropriately on your website, the billboard, whatever that might be, you have to have research. Well, a lot of community-based organizations are having to refer those individuals out to check the box for research involvement. And now network integrity can be improved because we're actually keeping those individuals within the organization. And then when you get to some of the other financial aspects of that, you can look and say, well, it's not just the budgetary dollars that are net revenue into the organization. We also can look at cost savings with, part of our organization is self-insured up in the Wisconsin region. So you can look at pharmacy savings for individuals that may be offered products through clinical trial, that now the self-insured portion of the organization is not having to pay for those, or other treatment or care that's provided during the course of a study. This may be additional laboratory work or imaging or so forth, that we're now bringing that income into the organization that otherwise wouldn't have presented itself. So you and I both well know, everybody listening well knows, that those protocols oftentimes will have additional laboratory imaging. They may have additional evaluations that are necessary by their physicians. Let's pretend that we're doing a investigational product study in inflammatory bowel disease that requires an ophthalmologist to do an evaluation or a pulmonologist to do pulmonary function testing. We've now increased our referral numbers within our own network simply because the protocol dictates that we need to perform those pieces of that puzzle, and we wouldn't otherwise be having those referrals and that revenue captured within the organization. So each of those things kind of lead towards those advantages to, number one, why do this, anyway? And then allows the organization to have a much more broad picture of, wow, research is a far greater benefit to the organization just than red or green numbers on a spreadsheet. When we look at net revenue, we're also looking at cost savings. We're also looking at reduction in risk exposure to being involved in certain self-insurance plans or other cost sharing plans, and then all of the other things with network integrity, physician recruitment, becoming more relative in the community system or in the community as a whole, and then offering those additional options to patients that were otherwise available. So that's really the foundation that was all started upon, and that each of those 5 pillars was really necessary for the organization to put its correct foot forward to make sure that this wasn't a fleeting moment, or it might be a good thought to do research. And you and I both well know that the literature is very clear that most principal investigators, it's a one and done. It's right. A very high percent. And a lot of that is because they either don't have institutional backing, they don't have the appropriate training, the proper infrastructure. Their restaurant is opened up, and then they figure out very quickly that it's either too expensive, takes too much time, they don't have the appropriate infrastructure, the menu is too narrow or too broad, the critics are too vocal, all of these other pieces that we've already talked about. And so when we really look at engaging those investigators, then now that's a completely, additional topic that you had mentioned about how do we properly, really engage those physicians? How do we keep them interested? But before we go into that, we can kind of stop, work through any of the questions or comments or anything that comes to mind
Yeah,
with
no,
you.
I mean, no, I think that's perfect. And I think, by now, I mean, again, we're doing this all the time. The benefits should be pretty clear to, community hospitals, health systems, as far as, why they should be doing research. I mean, even as I talk to a lot of practices, I mean, again, as well as I do, a lot of times the first question is, how much time is this going to take, and how much money am I going to make, or how much is it going to cost me, alternately. So I do want to talk too a little bit about the challenges, and actually there's a great question here from Maria Elena, talking about RVU compensation system, which is oftentimes a barrier. Now, look, there's obviously a ton of, and Jamie started to touch on these at the end, a ton of barriers as to why physicians don't participate in research. I think this has been, we could probably do a whole separate topic about, physician engagement and, not just, I mean, the styles, physician preference. I really do think it's incredibly, what's the saying? Like, you can have it two of the three: cheap, fast, or good. Pick two of the three. I feel like you can do it cheap and fast, or let me go backwards. You can do it cheap and good, which I think are probably the best ways, but it's not going to be fast. It's going to be a slow relationship building process. But something that was very important to me, and I do espouse this, if you're going to work with the system, you have to work out a compensation system for physicians. And I think you've probably seen this too, because physicians want to make sure their time is paid for, right? And that it's accounted for properly, because if it comes down to it, if they have to choose and one's being paid and one's not, they're going to do the one that's being paid, and as they should. So I guess you went through this whole process here, with the system. I'm incredibly grateful, because it's something I made a big deal about when I, worked towards a contract with SSM, and it hadn't been fully worked out at the time. So I guess, just elaborate a little bit,
Sure.
maybe about what that looks like. I know when I work with private practice physicians, it's a little different scenario. Obviously, I can pay them directly. I can pay them different amounts based on protocol, and it's a little less complicated. Here, we're dealing with a system. Obviously, the system wants to be compensated fairly. They want their space and energy paid for as well. So I guess talk about the considerations there.
Sure. It's a great question, Maria Elena. It's, that's one of the first questions probably that any physician that we engage, their eyebrows raise, and they have the first response is, yes, I'm interested in research. Oh, by the way, how am I going to get paid? I'm not in an academic institution. I don't have a percent of my FTE that's just carved out for research that's guaranteed. I do work on an RVU model, and so I'm sort of eating what I kill. And how can this research benefit me, benefit my patients? Now, granted, there are a number of clinicians who are altruistic and may say, okay, listen, I'm willing to compromise some of that RVU generation so that I can engage in research, because that's why I moved into medicine. There are a number of other individuals within the field of medicine who appropriately so want to know how they're compensated. And this has been a very detailed process of which we dissected every portion of it to come up with an appropriate and a fair method by which we compensate our research clinicians. We really have two different models that we work under for physician compensation. Now, any of the things that we do in research, those just in a broad sense, they do not supersede any of the physician employment agreements. If the physician has either, if they're on a professional services agreement or if they're fully employed, our agreements in research are merely addendums or riders onto those. They're still subject to the compensation caps that are set forth by the organization's policy on physician compensation. And we spend an extreme amount of time looking at, from a corporate responsibility lens and from a regulatory and a legal lens, fair market valuation. So depending on type of trial, we will engage physicians in one of two different compensation models. One of those models is that if we're merely doing some sort of post-market registry type study where there's limited PI hands-on time, this may be a single visit enrollment, and then everything else is performed and monitored either through electronic communication by the sponsor for e-diaries or those types of things, or it may be a single blood draw for a project that's looking at an advanced cancer diagnostic testing platform or something of that nature. If there's very limited PI involvement, then we'll really contract those based on an FMV hourly rate, to where patients, our clinicians are really paid in three different buckets. And one is their study startup time and hours taken for protocol review and training and so forth. Then bucket number two is basically their physician or their principal investigator oversight time for meeting with monitors, reviewing source documents, any other sign-offs that are necessary on any of those CRFs or those types of things. And then bucket number three is if there is any other clinical facing involvement that's necessary, if these are non-RVU generating physician and subject visits, we then reimburse them an appropriate FMV approved per hour rate within that bucket number three. So that's one way by which that they're not having to sacrifice their RVU generating time, and that their research visits are still being paid in a complementary fashion, but those are specific events such that they are not standard of care. They are not billed to a patient's insurance. We have a specific research code that goes within our charge capture system, so that when that encounter is closed, it bills a zero charge to insurance, and it bills research such that then those are paid at the end of each month. So that's one way by which we compensate physicians. The other way by which we do so is a very very interesting model that we came up with, and this is a percent of study revenue into the organization. And we contracted with an outside legal entity who performed a very detailed fair market valuation for different subspecialty areas that might be involved in research. And we have a very detailed FMV table based on employed or independent contractor physicians, and high and low values for percent of study revenue that comes into the organization that can be appropriately paid to those investigators for their time. And so those letters of agreements look completely different in that those more complicated studies, whether they be interventional, procedure-driven investigational device, or even more complicated investigational product drug studies, we contract those physicians such that they are being reimbursed or compensated a percent of the study revenue, and that has become a much more attractive method by which the physicians, the majority of them, comment to me, and that they feel that is extremely fair, or even more than fair, when they have purview to what those study budgets are, and see what the revenue after expenses paid are. And so basically, from a high level view, Brad and his organization and SSM, we have an agreement such that we revenue share, so that expenses can be paid, all of the infrastructural fees can be paid that go along with Brad and his team. And when I say fees, I don't necessarily mean these aren't upfront fees. There's no cost to the organization upfront. Both of us have to be engaged to have benefit here. And so once we have that revenue share, then the percent of revenue that comes into our organization, we then have those letters of agreements with our physician for a percent of that compensation. And to this point, once we've moved to that particular form of compensation, the question about the RVU system and taking clinical time away has really become a moot point.
Yeah, and again, I think this is, I mean, everywhere else I've worked and where I've, many conversations I've had, it's clear that not nearly enough thought has gone into the physician compensation side. And again, it's a little different. Like when I'm working with a private practice, we can get, we can go through every line and, mark things off. We can do percentages. You get a little creative. But I think if you're working with the system, especially I'm speaking kind of more to the people on my side, if you're trying to partner, I think it's it's a catch-22, right? Obviously, I can't tell SSM what to do. We can't tell them how to pay their physicians or not. But again, very clear up front in saying you need to do something, and it needs to make sense for these physicians, because even the most altruistic physicians in the world will eventually, get tired of not being compensated properly for the time that they put in. And again, that's just one, a fairly big one, but I think one reason why you see it not be successful, even for the most well-meaning and engaged physicians. Again, over time, they want to be compensated appropriately. I think it's perfectly fair to do that, and there's generally more than enough money to go around to ensure that that's done. Again, I feel like it's not been maybe addressed well enough when we talk about, well, why don't physicians do research? Well, because they run around in circles and don't get paid for it. And instead, they could be in the cath lab. They could be in the endoscopy suite. They could be seeing patients all day. And again, being compensated appropriately. So I want to tack in on that too, because I've seen this mistake a lot from relationships like ours, or even some that are slightly different. You talk to people and they've got, you know what, we've got access to all these doctors. We should be able to do amazing. We can kill it in research. And obviously, it's important to have good physician relationships, but as time's gone on, I've learned that it would be better to have one great relationship than 10 mediocre ones, probably, when it comes to, success of a research program. So I guess what have you seen in terms of what makes it successful within a system, knowing that, you guys already have hundreds or maybe thousands of personalities to sort of manage and to, cater to all the other things that go into running a health system. What's been the sort of, distinction between who's successful and who's not?
Sure. Well, I think it really started with casting a broad net. Just in our medical group within the organization here, there's about 350 unique clinicians, whether they be physicians or advanced practitioners. And we spent a fair bit of time in the beginning knocking on doors, really introducing
just awareness in the beginning, just awareness that it's even an option. And we're still, I think, fighting that battle to some degree.
Correct. Yeah. Just casting that net and bringing that awareness to all of the clinicians, and not just the clinicians, but even administrative staff within the organization, and understanding what we were doing, what we were attempting to build, why we were doing that, what infrastructure was put in place, convincing at times, whether it be the legal side, the corporate responsibility side, mission integration, regulatory, that all of the correct pieces were in place, especially not having a local IRB. But it really was this wide net that was casted, and it was knocking on physician doors across all general practice and subspecialty areas. Anybody that would listen of, let me introduce what we are attempting to do, and do you have any interest level? And we really just laid it back into the physician to decide, do they have an interest level, or did they feel that either A, that's why they're not in academic medicine, so they don't want to do research, or B, did they feel like it was going to take too much time away from their clinic-based practice or their procedural-based practice? And we narrowed down those that said, yes, I'm interested, and no, that I'm not. And then those that were interested, it was more specific conversations about defining what our infrastructure was, how we were able to support them, what these compensation letter of agreements look like, so that they have all of the necessary information to make an informed decision. And then once the physicians understood that we had the capability, we had the appropriate regulatory and other types of things in place, the proper infrastructure, the way by which they could be compensated for their time, then the question that I ask the physicians is not necessarily what studies or types of studies do you want me to recruit for you? It becomes, what do you not have an interest in? Because there are plenty of studies out there that we can recruit into the organization, but if we don't have either the appropriate patient population or the desire by the investigator to want to seek those out and enroll those, we've done nobody a service by taking those studies on. Now, I see plenty of organizations, and you have across your career as well, that's a come one, come all. They don't even consider the ethics of, can we enroll in this study or not? Instead, we just want the study startup dollars and the closeout dollars, and we're going to make no effort into. And I see a lot of that in these organizations that are driven by venture capitalist dollars and that are answering to boards that are having to produce certain milestones within revenue and so forth. But the counter side of this, and this is again another completely different topic, we see a pandemic slowdown. We see a Silicon Valley Bank close down, which was heavily invested in the research world, and we start seeing venture capitalists call their money due. And when we have these organizations that took 10, 20, $30 million in venture capital money, and they're really performing no more studies than what you and I are at a community-based system, with bootstrap pulling it up, no venture capital money. When it comes to those slowdowns, or if a study's not able to be enrolled in, or a bank closes, and these investors want their dollars back, we're seeing organizations that were in the venture capital funded world that are collapsing at this point, whereas we've been sheltered from that because we've not gone necessarily down that road. But
it's funny. I mean, I think you've got the same problem that you see at academic medical centers, just different, right? It's still, because it's still top down. Essentially, it's that there's pressure from above. Which, I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't matter how much pressure is from above if you can't engage with physicians, if you don't have good physicians, if you don't have a good boots on the ground. It doesn't matter if it's, a department chair or, an investor calling his money back. You've got pressure over your head, which is forcing you to take every bad opportunity that comes your way. And, I've worked in those places where we felt pressure to take every trial opportunity that comes, even when we know it's not a good fit. Yeah, okay, cool. Maybe we'll get our 15 grand up front. Hopefully we don't burn a bridge with the sponsor. And for better or worse, we haven't yet really seen a situation where sponsors are punishing sites for this. I mean, my previous job, they just got awarded by the same sponsors no matter what. Even if we did nothing, we'd keep getting awarded time and time again. I mean, I think eventually that's why, this will change. I think, Stacy mentions, Javara, which I think, I started around the same time. I believe they were officially founded. I mean, people like Dan Sfera have been working this model for 20 years, probably close to it, 10 years at least. It's not uncommon, not as uncommon as I think it's made out to be. But I think this is where we need to continue to go is out into these community relationships and community partners. I think you've seen, as well as I have, most sponsors are tripping over themselves to get involved with these types of relationships because they know they've got the best of all worlds. We can move quickly. We have all the support that comes with the health system, and you've got experts on the ground to recruit and oversee, patients along, in conjunction with PIs. So again, it's almost a no-brainer. But, again, to your point, does it need to be? It never works when it's top down. It just doesn't. You need. Again, you talk about knocking on doors. I mean, it's literally that level of sort of personalized attention, I think. Again, you got 10 PIs, but if they don't like you, who cares? You got nothing. They're not going to give you their patients. They're not going to entrust you to, walk their patient through the journey of being in a clinical trial. So it's not just the money. It's not just the prestige that comes with doing trials. It's the trust and relationship, I think, that goes into the whole clinical trial process. I don't know. it's really funny. I thought we would go. I feel like we barely scratched the surface in this conversation. Like maybe we need to do like a series that breaks down like individual topics, because the more we talk about it, the more you really realize that there's so many facets to this, right? And I mean, you need so many little gears to turn to keep the big wheel turning. It becomes increasingly complicated, like almost the more you begin to go down the rabbit hole, you know?
Yeah, no, completely agree. And, as you mentioned, so many of these principal investigators, it's a one and done, or they just figure out quickly that they, but if they would have had the appropriate infrastructure and relationships, at times it's hand holding. At other times it's putting some guardrails on. Even experienced investigators, sometimes we have to rein that back in a little bit, but it really is uniquely defining the ability to interact with each PI on his or her own level, and that's really what's been powerful, at least in our early success is that it's not a one size fits all. And even within a particular department, we may have 4 or 5 investigators that are all boarded, certified in a particular subspecialty area, all involved in research projects with us, whether that as a PI or a sub-I. But each of them we have to approach in a different way. Their nursing staff to help us recruit, their physician office staff, the physicians themselves, they all have a different approach to medicine. They have different personalities. And that's one of the unique things that we've been able to do in this partnership, is be able to take timely resolution of questions, queries, concerns, successes, and those types of things to each of those physicians, to answer all of those questions, to resolve anything with rapidity, and make sure that we move forward on the best foot possible. So it is really an individualized approach to each of those physicians. And I think another piece that I am hearing more and more commonly is that I don't know that we would have been nearly as successful without the ability to speak a clinician's language from a clinician to clinician, and then be able to follow that with not only an expert knowledge of the industry-sponsored clinical trial world, but then be able to administer, basically put the money where the mouth is by saying, okay, yep, I can talk your talk. And yes, I know all of the infrastructural pieces, and all of that we're talking about, I can show you how we're going to do that internally and with our partnership. And I think that's been one of the vital pieces when I hear others that say, well, listen, Brad, Jamie, we've listened to everything that you've said, and we have taken notes, and we've tried to implement every piece of this puzzle. But why can't we get the same level of engagement from an organization or from physicians or those type of things? I really think that part of that is physicians need to have the confidence in some of that clinical exchange, and that we can have the most experienced PhD level trained researcher, but without some of that clinician to clinician engagement, that discussion can fall flat, because again, clinicians are clinicians for a reason. They're not all innately born as researchers. We have to teach that. And so I think those various aspects of having the clinical acumen, the research background, and then having an extremely well-versed partner that sits at the table alongside me when we meet with these physicians, it's really the trifecta that allows us to get the physician and the organizational buy-in that, okay, we hear what you're saying, but we can see that not only have you personally, both of you, put it into practice at other organizations and within our organization, we trust that you've got the ability to support me as a physician as I step out into maybe as a new or as a not as seasoned investigator. And I think you could probably speak to this as well. In the studies that we have with the 20 or 30 PIs that we've engaged with in our organization, we have some who have decades of clinical trial experience, whether it be in their past lives in the academic institution or so forth. And we have others who are fairly new physicians in general, not many years out of residency or fellowship training, who are very interested in research. And we're their first springboard. We're their first introduction into the trial world. And we've been, I mean, it's nice to say we've been successful with our most junior PI at meeting enrollment goals and becoming successful in trials, all the way to our most seasoned clinicians. And even with those seasoned PIs, you have some who are very heavily engaged, others who take a little more of a hands-off approach, and we have to sort of spur them along at times. But again, that's that individualized approach, which is so often lost in the research world of we can be the best IRO or SMO or whatever it might be. But if we can't engage with those physicians on their level clinically, meet their compensation or reimbursement needs, and then be able to answer all of their questions in a way by which they can understand it, they're going to lose their interest. We can have all kinds of physicians that say, yep, Brad, Jamie, I am 100% bought into this research thing. And then if we don't land a study in their particular subspecialty area for 3 or 6 months, if we've not maintained that regular ongoing maintenance of that PI relationship, they may be lost now permanently to follow up. They may have decided, hey, listen, you guys had me on the hook. You didn't get me a study. And now I'm not as interested as I might have been in before. And I think that's, again, another topic that we could spend hours on about how do we engage those physicians? How do we keep them engaged even when there aren't a lot of trial opportunities that are coming? How do we get them involved with other aspects of research to keep them interested so that they want to maintain that involvement?
Yeah, I know we're pretty much out of time, but I mean, there's a lot to unpack within that. And, you know, you've seen it too. Doctors who have been burned by previous research relationships. They don't want to do research anymore. So I think it's extremely important if you're out there and you're working with new physicians, support them well, do a good job. Don't burn a bridge where they could be a great investigator, but they have a bad experience. And then, ultimately, I still think people underestimate the sort of lift that is giving physicians just what you talked about. I mean, they don't want to hear a sales pitch from an MBA. They don't care about that. They don't want to hear theory from a PhD. They want to hear practical information. It doesn't need to be too burdensome. It is about striking the right balance, right? And you can't do that, I think, without getting pretty intimate in your relationship, so to speak. Really sitting down with them, looking in their eyes, feeling them out, having the conversation, addressing each of their issues. It's a long and sometimes arduous process. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but ultimately, I've seen it happen multiple times with multi-million-dollar investment companies. They go out, they get a bunch of doctors on board, they think they've conquered the world, and then they can't keep them engaged, or they can't get the studies running properly because they can't climb those hurdles. So again, we're kind of at our time here. I really think we may want to consider drilling down into some individual topics. I think there's a lot to unpack. But otherwise, where can people find you online?
Sure. Well, I mean, they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. Otherwise, if you were just to Google my name, it obviously comes up. You could find me in any number of electronic methods, or by phone, whatever it may be. But LinkedIn is an easy way to connect. Should others have questions or want to dive in a little deeper, or have suggestions for future topics that we can really nail down. I mean, we spent we spent an hour talking about years worth of work, and we could take a microscope and dissect each of these things, and depending on the lens that we were to look through, we could spend days and days talking about all of these pieces of the puzzle, which are very, very important. And again, I like to use that restaurant model, and if people can walk away kind of thinking about all of that goes into that particular service arena, we are really no different in that. If you can really extrapolate that and you start looking through each of those pieces, we could do a segment on each and every one of those like-minded positions, and really kind of help move this, as one of the other commenters were, is that, yeah, I think there are several of us in the trial arena, in the research world, that really want to see community partnerships flourish. And that's really the future in research. That's really where we're going to get the diversity in our subject enrollments. It no longer needs to be just dictated by what can enroll on the East and West Coast. There's a lot of the rest of the country that has a very, very important information to supply through enrolling subjects in these trials. And the only way we're going to do that is through community involvement. We've tried it through academic institutions. Yeah, we're still going to have some of the main players just for name recognition on these studies. But you and I both know that the majority of the enrollment comes from your community-based partnerships. We just can't see them be a revolving door and come in and out. We need to get them engaged, teach them, provide them the infrastructure through these types of partnerships, so that we can build up strong community-based research footprints all across the country, to really capture the needs of the trial world.
No, well said. You guys check out notefilepodcast.com. Check out the recording of this, as well as our other live streams. And again, I predict we'll have a nice series of things to cover here in the future. So thanks for coming on, Jamie. I'm sure I will still end up talking to you again today at some point.
Yes, sir.
About one thing or another. But again, thanks guys for tuning in, and we'll be back next week.
Thanks.